Welcome, everybody. Nice to see you all in Boston, at least this absolutely gorgeous spring day. And I would like to introduce James Finley. Many of you know him, but a few words about his background. James did his bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering at Florida A&M University. He then transitioned to Chicago and did his master's and PhD at Northwestern in biomedical engineering. After that, he did a stint at Johns Hopkins, I believe in neuroscience with Amy Bastian, and then took up his position at USC, and where he is now associate professor. And I looked through your publications, and I found a lot of names in the walking community that I recognize, from Randy Trumbauer, Max Donnellan, Amy Bastian, Faye Horak, Yoshin Daher, and Eric Perot, and some of them we actually already had here in Action Club. So it's about time that we have you speaking to us. So welcome.
All right. Well, thank you for the introduction, Dagmar. And I just noticed that Eric was here, I think maybe in January. Um, and so that I think provides a really great overview of my background. And you'll see some of that throughout this talk. And really just to sort of provide some context, my interest is I would say in the neuromechanics of learning. So this stems from my background in mechanical and biomedical engineering, a lot of the work I did as a graduate student, really trying to understand this interaction between the nervous system, the musculoskeletal system, and the environment. So that's a key theme that has sort of persisted throughout my research. So go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, so today I'll be providing an overview of some of the recent work that we've been doing in my lab over the past, maybe five or 6 years now. And this has really been guided by this desire to understand trade-offs between effort and stability or balance control during locomotion. So to provide some context and a starting point, I wanted to start, where I started, and I think where a lot of people began when they think about the neural control of walking. And that's sort of these, sort of canonical images from Kendall and Schwartz, right? So for most people in the world of neuromotor control, when we think about the neural control of walking, we immediately go to this idea of the central pattern generated, and a lot of the really amazing neurophysiology that's occurred, I mean, over the last 100 years, right? It's been quite some time, and this really impressive observation that in the absence of descending input from the brain, the hind limbs of cats, and this has been demonstrated in other animals as well, can produce this rhythmic pattern of stepping. So I still remember when I first learned about this in graduate school, I can actually picture that moment. And really from there, I spent many years as what I might call a spinal chauvinist, right? I was just amazed by the complexity of patterns that the spinal cord could generate and how things like reflexes could modulate the neuromechanics of the limbs. However, this focus on rhythmicity as being this dominant feature of locomotion, I think is problematic when we start to move toward bipedal walking in particular. So there are several challenges of walking on 2 feet, right? So the first being that we have a really small base of support, particularly when we're in single stance. And so if we take our body's center of mass, we project it onto the ground. When we are in the single limb stance phase of walking, it's almost always outside of that, the area of our feet. Right? And so we would consider this to be statically unstable. So a lot of people refer to walking as controlled falling for this reason. Now, we can also think about the dynamics in a little bit more, maybe a finer level of detail. And one of the challenges, if we think about control of walking, is that one, if we think about the mapping between force and acceleration, so Newton's second law here, not only is this mapping nonlinear, right? So it depends on the configuration of our body, but we have this discontinuity that happens every time we hit the ground. So these are referred to as hybrid dynamics. So these mappings change based on posture, and they are discontinuous at impacts. And then finally, we have a problem with what's called under actuation, right? So we have fewer, let's say, independent actuators than we have degrees of freedom. A simple way to think about this is that, if we consider our pelvis, for instance, as being our base, we do not have direct control over our pelvis position and whole body orientation. Now, this was, I think, was most evident for me when we tried to use, in some of our work, simulation work, simple CPG-based control to control a walking simulated biped. And you see very easily that you can have very precise control over joint level degrees of freedom, and your biped can rotate backward or forward or drift because you're not accounting for those other under-actuated degrees of freedom. Now, as just a matter of, to get some interaction here, so we're talking about bipedalism. I'd like for maybe some adventurous people to give some thought to other animals or other creatures in the animal kingdom that are habitually bipedal. Right? So if you just throw some examples in the chat, I'd like to get people thinking about, how common is bipedalism in general in the animal kingdom?
Yeah, the old guinea fowl.
Yeah. So we have some people participating. I like this. I gave a 2-hour lecture about locomotion 4 hours ago. So yeah, I like to do this because everybody comes up with the similar examples. We could think of countless examples that are quadrupedal, but bipedalism is actually not all that common in the animal kingdom. So we have the guinea fowl, as Dagmar just mentioned, penguin, someone else said ostrich, and this is my new favorite biped, the pangolin. So if you want to see some really great videos of bipedal walking, just Google pangolin gait, and they're pretty amazing. Right? So bipedalism is not something that is a common solution to locomotion in the animal kingdom, right? And these other animals often have other ways of moving through their environment. And so while we can sort of appreciate how cute some of these animals are in their ability to walk on 2 feet, there's something really special, I think, about humans. And so we're gonna take a pause and appreciate the skill with which humans can move on 2 feet. So hopefully this video shows up. Oh. Is this video showing up for people? No.
No.
All right, of course. There we go. Now?
Yeah.
All right.
A little bit, yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. So hopefully you could see the level of skill which this is a skier, he's an 18-year-old skier doing some cross training here. And you can see all the different ways that at least he can move through the environment on 2 feet. This requires not just rhythmic flexion and extension, but things like precise foot placement, balance control, um, and even sometimes interaction with other parts of the environment with the upper extremities. Now, that is all well and good, but a lot of what we focus on in our lab is what happens when we have damage to the brain. So this is a video, an animation of 300 MRI scans from people post-stroke from one of our colleagues, Dr. Sukli Liu at USC, where the colors correspond to, it's a heat map based on the number of lesions in that part of the brain. And so I just wanted to show this illustration because this is the problem that a lot of us are facing in the world of neurorehab, is that large parts of the brain can be damaged following stroke, and these lead to several problems with mobility. So at a general level, we know that when people have a stroke, they typically walk more slowly than those of us who do not have neurological impairments. And we can measure several aspects of their mobility to kind of capture some of what we refer to as impairments. So if we use motion capture and we measure kinematics, we'll notice that, for instance, if you've had a stroke, you often have difficulty flexing your knee during the swing phase of walking. And that can be really problematic because it can reduce foot clearance. We can also measure things like measures of asymmetry, which I'll focus a lot on today. And we know that people post-stroke typically take steps that are of unequal length. And so this is an issue that we think may be potentially problematic. Now, these are impairments at the level of sort of, let's say, kinematics or spatiotemporal measures. But reasons why these may be problematic, aside from aesthetics, are that number one, we know that people post-stroke have a much higher, what we call energetic cost of transport. So you can just think about this as the cost in joules to move 1 kilogram of mass 1 meter. And this figure is taken from data that we collected where we have age-matched control participants walking at the self-selected speed of our post-stroke individuals. Okay? So even when you control for speed, individuals post-stroke have a much higher energetic cost. And then maybe most importantly, this is just an illustration of the issue of falls. And this is just showing longitudinally how many people post-stroke fall relative to controls, where actually the y-axis is non-fallers. So the line at the bottom, the lower solid line, shows that you have fewer people post-stroke who are not falling compared to controls if you measure them over time. Now, the key question for us in I think, neurorehabilitation is, at what level should we really intervene, right? So we really want to know, like, our objective is to improve mobility, which is a bit of a vague goal, right? So we need to figure out, one, what do we mean by improvement? What is our measure of goodness? And two, at what level should we intervene to affect that measure? So one more slide before kind of taking a break here. And one of the best, I think, sort of descriptions of why this question is challenging comes from this paper that hopefully many of you have seen from Mark Latosh and Greg Anson. So at least I'll speak about some of the world of physical therapy, right? So it's, I think, intuitive to say that one of the goals of rehabilitation is to restore, let's call it, normal function. And maybe that normal is measured in terms of kinematic things like asymmetry. The problem is that that goal assumes that the way that we move, or those of us who do not have neurological impairments, is just as good, or should be what people should do once the brain or other parts of the neuromuscular system are damaged. And there's not a lot of evidence, frankly, to support that notion. And a lot of the work that we're doing, I know others are as well, is to understand questions like, if we restore observationally normal kinematics, how does that affect measures of quality, such as energetics or balance? So I'll take a short little break here in case there are any questions, points of discussion so far.
You showed the energetics of strokes versus controls. What about old versus young?
Okay. So I specifically showed data for aged matched controls. And this is the question here is about the energetics of walking and aging. That's a good question. My intuition, I can't refer to a study off the top of my head. My intuition is that the energetics energetic cost might increase with age for, matched speeds, but I don't know of any study off the top of my head that's explicitly explored that. Though we have data in the lab to answer that question.
So I remember that paper. Isn't the discussion then, what is the best abnormal pattern that the patient develops versus unwanted compensatory movements, right? And so to divide between those two is probably the critical issue.
Right, so this question of what is best is really challenging. So I guess I'll maybe start with the issue of compensatory movement. So, let's imagine that you have paresis of the right leg, right? So you have reduced ability to propel yourself with the right leg, but you still need to cross the street. You are likely to use a compensatory strategy, which means something that you wouldn't do if you didn't have that impairment so that you can achieve the task. And there are what you might call adaptive compensations, or maybe let's say positive adaptations and maladaptive compensations. And so I think another big challenge is to distinguish between the two. So for instance, asymmetry could be maladaptive if it leads to a higher incidence of something like osteoarthritis. And these are questions that I think are still up for debate in the field. Okay. All right, so go ahead and move forward here. So in general, in the lab, we are interested in studying, or we study different populations to understand how, let's say, different states of neurological function influence what at least I'll say I think about as measures of sort of quality of movement, so the goodness of someone's behavior. Right. Whereas things that might use more energy than normal, I would typically think are maybe not ideal, and things that or movement strategies that impair balance would also be sort of less ideal than those who don't. And the goal of this, of course, for us is both to answer fundamental scientific questions, but also to inform the context of therapy. So in the lab, there are several approaches that we take to study locomotor control. Those of you familiar with some of the work at least I've done is talk a little bit today about adaptation, and why we use split belt adaptation in the lab. We do a lot of work to understand the process of recovery, the costs of different compensatory strategies that arise in people post-stroke in the context of neurorehab. And then what I don't think I'll have time to discuss today is almost the other half of our lab, which really deals with both developing interventions, VR-based interventions, and understanding fundamental principles of learning and generalization when people train in virtual environments. So I'd like to switch gears and talk a little bit about why is it that we study this task of split belt adaptation. And the context here is really that it's, I think, a good model to help us understand potential costs of asymmetry. So if we look at this video here, this is just motion capture taken of a participant who's had a stroke. And from watching this video, I think it's pretty easy to see that they walk with an asymmetric gait pattern. And so they spend more time on one leg than the other. They take steps that are not the same length. And a big question in our field, maybe historically, has been, what should we do about this, right? Should we try to correct this asymmetry? And so a lot of the work that we've done in the lab seeks to understand how people regulate symmetry during walking and in different contexts. And then once we know that, we try to understand what are the, again, functional consequences of that. And with these measures on the right being what we think about in terms of function. So if you're not familiar with the way in which people adapt when walking on the split belt treadmill, hopefully this makes it relatively clear. So what we often do is we put people on our treadmill and we'll make one belt move 3 times faster than the other. If you've never done this, it seems like it shouldn't be possible, at least by description. But what happens is when you first, what we call split the belts, you see that people walk with a limp, right? So you see a very clear asymmetry.
James.
Yes.
Can I just briefly interrupt? As you're using quite a few videos, they're very choppy today. I think you need to, we tried them out the other time. So did you do some optimize for sharing video?
I'm going to exit and reshare just in case. So I didn't change the videos, which is...
Yeah, so it worked the other day.
It usually is that optimization for sharing videos, and it's a little checkbox on the bottom left when you get a share.
So this is interesting. So now that checkbox is not available. It's grayed. Okay, well, I will just move on.
That is weird because we tried
just tried it, yeah.
Right, yeah.
This is the joy of technology, right? Okay, so I will, Lou has a suggestion.
Louis Awad suggested to make James a co-host. Can you do that, Reza?
It could also be that maybe you should try sharing the presentation rather than your screen. Maybe then it will give you the option.
Oh, okay. I can try that. Let's see if we can try both options. All right, I'll try that first. So we need to this. Okay, so I'm now sharing the presentation. Does that look any
a whole lot better. Okay. Yay, yes. What did you do?
I shared, so when I shared screen, instead of sharing the screen, I shared the presentation window.
Okay.
So who solved that problem for us? And what's your name?
I think it was Kara, right? No? There were Maddie.
Yeah. Others can get credit. It's okay.
All right, so yeah, I'll just show that again. So this is our individual post-stroke. Hopefully that is clear. And what I was just illustrating was what happens when people first step on our split belt treadmill. Okay. So here we can see when one belt is moving 3 times faster than the other, the person starts walking with this limp. So we would call this an asymmetric gait. Now what's I found most interesting when reading this literature is that most people, when given sufficient time, eventually adopt a walking pattern that is, we'll say, much smoother and ends up being more symmetric depending on which measures you use. Okay. So one way that we characterize this behavior is by measuring step lengths. So just the distance between the feet when the leading foot touches the ground. And we can see that during early adaptation. So let me get my pen. So during early adaptation, we see a marked asymmetry, so a difference in step lengths, and that difference decays over time. And now we've known for a while now that at the same time that people are becoming more symmetric, they're reducing the energetic cost of walking. So one of the key questions that we were interested in understanding is, again, to link the mechanics. So what is it that people are doing? What strategy are they using to reduce metabolic costs? And the answer to this question is really driven by thinking about the split belt treadmill in a manner similar to how we think about exoskeletons. And so with exoskeletons, when used as assistive devices, one of the objectives, particularly for those that focus on the lower extremity, is to reduce the metabolic cost of walking. And one of the basic ideas is that these devices, mostly powered, some passive, can perform mechanical work for the person. So if the device is able to perform the mechanical work to propel the body, the person doesn't need to do that with their muscles, and then that should lead to a reduction in metabolic cost. Okay. Now, one of the really interesting and I think really counterintuitive things is that this same principle holds when people walk on a split belt treadmill. And this is best illustrated by work from, this is led by Vincent Chu, who I think just defended at Stanford, who's in Steve Collins's group. And this is a completely passive device here. So let me, before I continue, did you all hear the audio there or no? Okay, great. All right. So this cart has 2 wheels of different size, one large and one small. And so what they're going to do is put this cart on a standard treadmill. So both belts are moving at the same speed, and unsurprisingly, the cart moves off the back. Now the right side is moving faster than the left. And you see that the device actually moves forward and can move up a grade. So this, again, the key, if you didn't catch this device is completely passive. It has no motors, only wheels of different size. Because of the difference in wheel size, the device can actually acquire work or require energy from the treadmill to propel itself. And so the question is, can we as humans use a similar strategy to harness energy from this difference in belt speeds? So I'll walk through the sort of theory about why we think this should be possible with humans. So during early adaptation, when the belts are first moving at different speeds, we're going to look at the power that is generated by the treadmill on the person, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So let's take this little illustration that I have here, and we're going to focus on the blue box for now. So when we think about power, right, we're interested in force and velocity, right, the dot product of force and velocity. And so in this example, the open arrow represents the reaction force of the treadmill, particularly the horizontal component of that reaction force. And the small, let me get my pen. And the small blue arrow here is the belt speed. Okay. So we can see that when you step on the slow belt, that arrow is small and blue, and the trailing limb in red is on the fast belt, and that arrow is longer and red. Okay. Now, for the leading limb, the treadmill's reaction force is in the same direction that the belts are moving. And so because those things are collinear, we can compute the product, and that is going to give us the power generated by the treadmill on the person at the time of foot contact. And we're going to illustrate that positive power using this open box here. Now, in contrast, for the trailing leg, we see that the belts are moving backward, but the reaction force, this open arrow here, is in the opposite direction of where the foot is moving. And so we can think about this as being our negative work. So I'll just do positive here, negative here. Now, here we can see that for this step, the area of the negative of the shaded box is larger than the open box. So in other words, the treadmill is essentially extracting energy from the person. We can do the same thing for the fast step. It's not super important to get those details here, but overall, during early adaptation, what we can predict schematically is that the treadmill should be performing more negative work on the person, or negative power for this illustration, than positive. Okay? So if we integrate this over a gait cycle, that would mean that the treadmill is actually extracting energy from the person. Now, during late adaptation, what we know is that people tend to take longer steps on the fast belt. And so why might that happen? Well, one reason, if we think about this from the perspective of energetics, is that by taking a longer step on the fast belt, we now increase that reaction force. So that's this solid arrow on the front box. And by doing so, we can let the treadmill perform work on us. Now, if we do this, look throughout the gait cycle, what we would predict is that when people take these longer steps on the fast belt, the treadmill is actually performing more positive work overall than negative work, and in essence is acting as an assistive device. So this is an argument based solely on geometry here. And so of course we want to test this experimentally. So I'll show several examples of studies that we do, well, a few examples, where we provide people with visual feedback, and we use this to do what we call map cost landscapes. And so why do we do this? Well, if we just place people on the split bill treadmill, they naturally adapt, and it's very difficult to measure what we might call the cost of a given asymmetry. So to deal with this problem, what we do is we give people trials where we give them a target asymmetry. So let's take where we have SLA of -0.15. So here we ask them to take a longer step on the right, as illustrated by the black bar. And they do this using online feedback of the markers that we place on their ankles. So this allows us to have individuals hold, more or less, a fixed level of asymmetry so that we can measure things like the metabolic cost of that specific asymmetry. And then we do this for a range of conditions.
Like for the first data set, how long does it take to adapt to something that, well, that sort of plateaus?
I will answer that question in 3 slides, 3 or 4 slides. That's a very important question, what we mean by plateau. Okay, so just kind of skip this next slide. So we use methods that were first published from Brian Selgrade, who was in Young-Hee Chang's group at Georgia Tech, to compute the work performed by the limbs. And the question is, how does this work, mechanical work, change as a function of asymmetry? So on the x-axis here, we have our measure of step length asymmetry, where positive values correspond to longer steps on the fast belt, right? This is what people tend to move toward at the end of adaptation. And on the y-axis, we have the work performed by the treadmill. We can think about this on the person. So for negative asymmetries, we see that that work rate is more negative. So that means, as I made the case for earlier, that the treadmill is extracting energy from the person. And then at positive asymmetries, you can see that the treadmill is actually performing work on the person. We can also compute the work that the person is performing, right? The work that they're performing with the legs. And so the key take-home point here is that the slope of this relationship is negative, which means that as people become more, their asymmetry becomes more positive, they actually perform less work with the legs. And so this is what we would refer to as taking advantage of assistance, right? The treadmill performs more work, therefore I perform less work.
So just to drive it home to me, what is the positive asymmetry? What is happening? Which leg does what now? Just to get it in my head.
Yeah, so this is, for the positive asymmetry, the key is that we have longer steps on the fast belt, okay? So our measure of asymmetry is actually the difference in step lengths. So let me just, so our step length asymmetry is going to be step length fast minus step length slow over the sum.
If I remember correctly, there was a slide a few slides ago. You were showing the adaptation profile of the lengths of steps. Maybe that could be a good illustration.
Right. So that's good. Let me do that. Okay. So these are the individual step lengths. So typically, so the white circles would be the slow step length. The black would be the fast. So typically what we see is that the slow step length will become shorter, the fast step length will become longer. So
On the right-hand side of that graph, what happens at 12.5 minutes with a big drop? Did you stop the belt or stop the split?
yes, so there, and this point, we stop the treadmill and then we have the belts move at the same speed again. So typically we do this this is really we use this as our measure of learning. This allows us to capture what we refer to as the after effect. I won't talk about that today, but you can see that on the left-hand figure here, where this asymmetry, right, the black dots here are more positive than the white, which is the opposite of what was observed during early adaptation. So that's generally what we use as our measure, that people are actually making a prediction about what should, well, there's essentially a prediction about what should happen that leads to this after effect.
Could I double check? So looking at the left-hand plot, say at the late stage, what is the steps asymmetry here? So they are of more or less equal length, if I can see correctly. Is there any asymmetry there?
So typically, in most studies that at least up until that point, were published looking at split belt adaptation. At the quote unquote end of adaptation, people would take steps of approximately equal length. So we might say that they're symmetric at the end of adaptation. What I'll show, and this is to get at Dagmar's question earlier, is that's actually not the end of adaptation. People continue to adapt. Good.
And now let me say something probably totally stupid here. Step length in external coordinates, because when the belt, races under you, you obviously on belt distance, you have to have longer step length, otherwise you fall off.
Yeah, so step length, I didn't illustrate this, but there are different ways to measure step length on a treadmill. What we typically do is we say, at the time the foot hits the ground, what's the distance between the ankles?
In external.
In, well, yeah, in lab, we measured in lab-based coordinates.
Right.
So it's a snapshot, and we just measure that distance, yeah.
Sorry, a follow-up question on that. Is the body center of mass is moving relatively at this constant velocity, or it rocks back and forth?
It rocks back and forth, definitely. So on average, people don't drift on the treadmill, but the center of mass of a lot. So we're talking about position now, which is, well, we're talking about distance between 2 points with step length. There's a problem that occurs when we think about velocity, in that we have to define velocity relative to a coordinate system. We don't define it relative to the belts because it's undefined, given that the belts are moving at different speeds. So we can define it in the lab's coordinate system.
James, there's another comment or question by Greg Savicki. Maybe Greg, speak up for yourself.
Hi, everybody. This is Greg. The data that you have showing the treadmill work available and transferred, I guess, by the calculation of F dot V at the ground reaction force interface, and then the data that goes with that, which is on the leg side of things. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to work out why aren't those exactly mirrored? Like, where is that, if the energies, are there internal degrees of freedom that are dissipating energy, like at joints that we don't see, or it seems like physics is violated there if those things aren't equal to each other?
Yeah, so excellent question. This is something that we didn't examine explicitly in this study, but to provide maybe even more elaboration on this point, one, I think what you said is likely possible. So all these calculations are based on this assumption, well, several assumptions, one of which is that we are essentially looking at a fixed length leg, right? Well, that's not actually true. The issue is that when the treadmill is performing work on the person, that work can be dissipated. In other words, people can change how they are moving. They can bend their knee, change how fast they're swinging their swing leg to dissipate some of the energy that the treadmill is, let's say, or some of the work the treadmill is performing on the person. So the other point related to this is that different people, if we look at the slope for different people, you would see some people are better at accepting this work than others. So this is, I think, similar to what you can maybe let me know what you might expect or observe with a more typical exoskeleton. We have some simulation work that's sort of in progress, where we have a nice simulation of this process in a multi-link biped, where we can get more information about what could be done at the joint level, right? If we're optimizing work, and we can compare that to experimental data. So that's in the pipeline.
Yeah, thanks for that. We're an exoskeleton group. We're always wondering where the available energy goes when people don't use it. And I think this is a really nice paradigm to ask those questions. Thanks, James.
No problem, Greg. Okay. Right, so people take advantage of this assistance, but they don't do it completely, which is the point that Greg just raised here. Now, this is mechanical work and specifically work by the legs, and we're focusing on positive work. Now the question is, how does this relate to metabolic costs? So
another quick experimental question from Misha. Misha, do you want to raise it yourself?
Okay. I'm just curious, how do you start the participants on this experiment? So, you know, because the training is probably very influential of where they end up. I'm just guessing, but.
Yeah, so we use what's called, this would be an abrupt perturbation, which means the treadmill is off. Then we accelerate both belts to their steady state speed. That acceleration takes, I believe, on the order of a few seconds for the fastest belt. Now, you could also do what's called a gradual perturbation, which has been done quite frequently in the study of sensory motor adaptation. Now, which would be a gradual increase in the difference in belt speeds.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, so people still perform, adapt their asymmetry the same way. It's just more difficult to observe because, they basically, more or less, if you do it slowly enough, they generally will remain symmetric for a long period of time. So
I see. Thank you.
Good question. All right. So one of the main observations here was that as people, so we already say that people reduce the positive work as their asymmetry becomes more positive. So that'll be moving from sort of the top to the bottom on the y-axis. And we see that there's a simultaneous reduction in metabolic power. If we then now do our full mapping and look at metabolic power as a function of step length asymmetry, we find that what we might call the energetically optimal asymmetry, there's some caveats there, is at positive values, right? So in other words, if we try to compute the minimum of this curve using permutation methods, we find that minimum is always positive. In other words, people should, if they want to minimize metabolic power, they should take longer steps on the fast belt. Okay.
Did you measure that metabolic power by oxygen consumption?
Yes. Oh, which I didn't mention. So we're doing expired gas analysis here. We measure, each trial is 6 minutes long, and we use the last 2 minutes of each trial to get the steady state metabolic, or actually O2 consumption, CO2 production. We use that to compute metabolic power. Okay, so now I can finally answer Dagmar's question about where do people plateau and when does this happen? So typically, most adaptation studies are 10 to 15 minutes long in terms of the amount of time people spend in the split condition. Now, as we illustrated in the figure before, if we look at the individual step lengths, it turns out that after 15 minutes, the step lengths are approximately equal. Okay? In other words, people are symmetric. They take symmetric step lengths. But I just said on the previous slide that if they are trying to minimize metabolic cost, that they should have positive asymmetries, right? Longer steps on the fast belt. But this isn't typically observed in published studies. There's some cases where that's not necessarily true though. Now, what we recently did in the recent study was to say, if you give people more time, more practice, do they move to these positive asymmetries? And yes, they do. So this is 45 minutes of adaptation. So we call this the most boring study in our lab. And what we find is that people do move to this space that we would predict if they were trying to minimize energetic cost. If we compare the positive work that they perform at 15 minutes relative to 45 minutes, we see that they're performing less positive work at 45 minutes and that their metabolic cost is also less at 45 relative to 15. So for us, yes.
Yeah, before you go more into this, just another basic thing here. While the step length may be identical, it doesn't need to be parallel symmetrically on the speed on the two belts, right? There could be a slight rotation of the pelvis such that one step is slightly ahead and the person rotates. Is that the case?
Ooh, so, okay, so this measure is a sagittal plane measure, right? It's the distance between the feet in the sagittal plane. But with pelvic rotation, you can also influence medial-lateral foot placement.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's actually important, that medial-lateral control or control of, I always get my yaw, pitch, and roll. I believe that would be yaw. If you noticed in the video that we provided with the cart, there was a little fin that was placed in between the treadmill belts. And that's because if you don't have the fin, the device will rotate.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something that humans also have to control.
Mm-hmm.
But with respect to this issue of symmetry, I don't know how much pelvic rotation there, or if there's maybe an asymmetry in pelvic rotation. There could be. Okay. All right, so to just finish up this story here, one of the reasons, so people study split belt adaptation for several reasons. I am particularly interested in it as a tool to understand objectives during walking. And for me, I think we have a lot of data now to really show that people are adapting to this device by learning how to use work performed by the treadmill to reduce their energy cost. And that the optimal behavior is asymmetric. There's some recent work by Jan Steenem and Julia Choi to understand the cost of asymmetric timing, which is sort of consistent with some of these ideas. And now, the other key point here is that when we talk about adaptation and the objectives, or where do people plateau, we have a problem here because it takes far longer to plateau than what people typically allot in their experiments. And so we're talking about at least three times longer than a typical adaptation. And so for us, we're always careful about saying whether this adaptation process is complete, because we need to test how long that would actually require. So I'll take a short pause here in case anyone has any questions or points of discussion.
Hi, Dr. Finley, I have a question.
Yeah.
About, so you mentioned that about you took longer step length and so they could decrease the metabolic cost, right, on the fast bill. But if the sort of the people who has a shorter step length at the beginning of their walking, but then when they adapt on the fast bill to increase their step length on the fast bill, what do you think about that? Will you think that also decrease their metabolic cost, or what's the direction? What will you think about that? Yeah.
In terms of how they change relative to where they begin?
Yeah. Yes. Correct.
Yeah. So typically it's you start with a short step on the fast belt,
Yeah.
And then you gradually lengthen that step over time. The idea being, as you gradually lengthen that step, that allows you to, it's really about stepping further forward. That's the key point, really. As you step further forward relative to your body, that allows the treadmill to perform more work on you. And but you have to learn how to accept that work. So just because the treadmill is giving you energy, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will reduce metabolic cost. You have to learn to, it's a complex coordination problem, but you have to learn to reduce the muscle contractions at the right time and across the right muscles in order to take advantage of that assistance. So that's a learning problem that, I don't fully understand. Maybe someone else does, but that's a really challenging learning problem, right? Which muscles at what times can I, quote unquote, turn off so that I can reduce metabolic costs?
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I have another question. Before adaptation, maybe the head kinematics or head motion maybe also becomes asymmetry. But after the adaptations, how head kinematics also changed or still remains asymmetry?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there is some nice literature that points. So this gets to an issue that we'll see how far we get into it, but there's an issue of balance control, and specific to your question about stabilizing the head.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So there's some nice work showing that, when people walk either over a smooth or an irregular surface, that they seem to have a tendency to stabilize the head regardless of what's happening with the lower extremities. Mm. We haven't specifically looked at that in our adaptation work, but yeah, I mean, I won't even really speculate there. There are definitely still asymmetries in terms of accelerations just because of the impact on the treadmill, but I don't know about other, aspects of that, the kinematics.
Okay.
We have two more questions. I think Reza was first.
Yeah, I had this question a few years ago. I asked Max Donovan same question. He didn't give me a convincing answer. I'm gonna ask it again. Gait is it has its own dedicated circuitry and all that, possibly. And what happens if you cognitively engage the participants or you give them explicit information about the way they are behaving? Do you know if that would change the way they adapt?
All right, so I can answer that question. I will try to do so in less than 40 minutes. So it's a complicated question. So one, there's a study by Laura Malone and others since then, I think this was in 2010 or 11, where they used distraction. So they have people watch an episode of Friends and count the number of times that certain word was, I don't know, they said Ross, I don't know, something like that. Sorry, this is annoying me. Okay. And so the idea was that to test whether this was what we might call an explicit process, right? Do we need to be cognitively engaged and make conscious choices about our stepping in order to adapt? Turns out when you distract people and they perform the secondary tasks, they still adapt the same way. Okay? So that provides some evidence that this is potentially more of an implicit adaptation. Now, you could also give people stepping targets to do two things. One, I can just give you a target that says, stay asymmetric, right? I can, take a longer step on the slow belt, short step on the fast belt. You can do that kind of indefinitely on the split belt. So I can prevent you from changing your motor pattern by giving you visual feedback. Now, the last part to this answer is that this task is actually sensory motor adaptation. So even if you hold people at an asymmetric gait, you prevent them from changing their asymmetry, they still change their perception of the belt speeds. Okay. So there's, at least to my knowledge, there's no way that people have blocked that part, the sensory component of the adaptation. And even if you hold them asymmetrically, if you then you stop the treadmill, make the belts move the same speeds again, you see an after effect. So the change in the motor behavior during adaptation is not necessary for them to learn as measured by the presence of an after effect. So a lot of details there, but hopefully that answers the question. All right.
All right, Maddie.
My question is about the slide where you had the step length across adaptation and then metabolic cost on the right side. So if I understand the plot correctly, the early section is where the split treadmill is moving at the same speed, and then you change the speed, and at the end also you have the sort of after effect where the belt is moving at the same speed again. So yes. If that's correct, then it seemed to me like the metabolic cost in the beginning before adaptation began is actually higher than the metabolic cost after adaptation. Like it comes down to a lower value than what it originally was. Is that the case, and why?
So this is one of these cases where, had I done the experiment again, I'd design it a little bit differently. At baseline and post-adaptation, the belts were both moving at 0.5 meters per second. Then during adaptation, one belt was at 0.5, the other was at 1.5. So the average speed during adaptation was faster than during baseline. And so even though metabolic cost is decaying throughout adaptation, at the end, it's still higher than it would be at baseline just because you're walking faster.
I meant after adaptation, right? The after effect.
Right. Let me just pull that up. Okay. This one.
Yep. So all the way to the right, the values are lower than the gray box on the right figure to the left.
Oh, sorry. So the gray box to the left is when the belts are moving at different speeds. So they're moving at 0.5 and 1.5. The gray box on the right, they're both moving at 0.5.
So what happens then from the gray box going into the white area? What is the change there?
The gray box is just illustrating. So we remove that transient period from the analysis because of the transient, right? Like when you start the treadmill, it takes about a minute for people for their metabolic cost to ramp up. And so we remove that part from the analysis.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have one more question.
Sure.
So in this experiment, you're focusing on the difference between the step lengths and the fast speed and then the slow speed belt. But I'm wondering how about like what's the ratio between the stance time, single stance time on the different belt? The reason I'm asking is that if the single stance time on the slower belt is like longer, then like average walking speed will be smaller, smaller. So like I'm wondering whether that during this split belt experiment overall, like whether the walking speed remains almost at the constant, or is it changed?
Yeah, we've had several discussions about this over the years. The problem is that once you're in a split belt condition, you can't define walking speed. So there's no way to define it because you're not moving relative to the lab. Right, so your speed would be 0 relative to the lab. And you also can't define it relative to the treadmill because the coordinate systems are moving, there's relative speed between the belts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense, but okay.
But
like in terms of the temporal time perspective, do you see like this kind of adaptation like effect as well on the both limbs, or does it remain the same?
So so with respect to stance time, you do learn to stand. You do learn to spend more stance time on the slower belt than the faster belt. I think that answers maybe the first part of your question. And there are temporal adaptations and temporal after effects in terms of your step times. So it's really difficult to think about all of these things together without the use of any sort of model.
I see. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So 20 minutes. Okay. So I think that's probably the densest part of this talk. Well, depending on your background. All right. So we stopped by talking about the role of energy and maybe energy optimization as a factor that might drive split belt adaptation. So we started today by talking really about neuro rehab and thinking about post-stroke gait. And so a question that for us came out of, was sort of going on in parallel is you could make an argument, or maybe not make an argument, but it's possible that even the impaired nervous system after a stroke is selecting a walking pattern that is most, what we might say, economical, right? The least amount of energy for a given speed. And so if so, then changing someone's gait would actually, at least in the short term, be problematic because it could increase the energetic cost, right? If the system has sort of self-optimized. And so we've had now several studies to try to understand the influence of asymmetry and changes in asymmetry on energy cost post-stroke. So now when we talk about step lengths, so this is another reason why, another level of complexity. So I'll just sort of draw a schematic here. So let's just imagine that this is our person. We have our step length here. Now that step length is due to both how far I place the leading foot in front of the body and how far my trailing limb moves behind the body. Okay, so that's basic, geometry here. It turns out that people have very different strategies post-stroke. So some people are asymmetric because of where they place the foot in front of the body. Other people's asymmetry is due to differences in the trailing limb. So in this 2015 paper, we did what we call a decomposition of this asymmetry such that we could characterize the contribution to step length asymmetry due to differences in foot placement, step time, and what we call step velocity. And now the question is, to what extent do these variables at least correlate with metabolic cost of walking? So if we look at the overall step length asymmetry or step length difference, we see generally a weak relationship with metabolic cost of transport. But what we've observed now in a couple different studies is that this foot placement asymmetry is actually more strongly associated with metabolic cost than overall step length asymmetry. So it seems to be where people place the feet that has the largest influence on their metabolic cost. And so a key question for us is now, if we take what we might call conventional clinical approach to reduce asymmetry, how does that affect the energy cost of walking? So as I mentioned, we're going to use this same protocol. And now this is just an example of data from one participant where their baseline step lengths are in red. So you can see that they're asymmetric. We then say, okay, do what you were doing at baseline, but let's have you follow our visual feedback. That's in yellow. So you can see we can use visual feedback. They don't, and ask them to hold the same level of asymmetry, and they can do that. And then finally, we can make the shorter step longer, right? We can say, okay, now walk with steps of equal length. And some people can do this very well. So you see on average, the green is hovering around 0 and is less asymmetric than the other two. So we did this, I think this might have been on the order of 25 participants. And on the left-hand side, this is just showing the magnitude of their asymmetry. Take-home point is in the symmetric condition here, they are less asymmetric than they are at baseline. However, there were no major changes over at the group level in terms of their metabolic cost. So that's the figure on the right. Now, this has also been demonstrated in a couple other recent studies that have used, in some cases similar, and in another case, a different approach to get people post-stroke to reduce asymmetry. And they found no group level differences in metabolic cost. So it's a little bit counterintuitive. People could walk more symmetrically and maybe not have an effect on metabolic cost. However, if we instead look at not just the step length asymmetry, but this foot placement asymmetry that I highlighted on the previous slide, we do find that how they change that foot placement asymmetry, which we at the time referred to as a position contribution, that is related to the change in metabolic cost. And specifically, it was actually that, right, so people who had a positive change in this foot placement contribution also had a tendency to reduce the metabolic cost of walking. So a little bit counterintuitive without going into too much detail, but the main take-home point here is that the way that people post-stroke reduce asymmetry has an important effect on how those changes in their gait pattern influence metabolic cost. And so now for the kind of final bit of what I wanted to share today. So we've just talked about energetics so far, but we may also imagine that asymmetries could be bad or potentially good by impacting people's balance control. So this is, frankly, a much more difficult question to answer than asking about metabolic cost, because we have to think about what is balance control, how do we measure it. Happy to have long discussions about that afterward. So, well, one of the ways that we've analyzed this or considered this behavior is by thinking about the state of the body, right? So we can think about balance control as being necessary to control, for instance, the orientation, velocity of the body. Well, orientation and velocity, as well as the force position. Now, one way that we can measure one of these, I think, important state variables is through looking at what we call whole body, or what is called whole body angular momentum. And the basic idea is that this captures how the body as a whole and the segments within the body are rotating about a specific axis. And so to do so, we do full body motion capture. We then estimate segmental kinematics using simplified models of segmental geometry. And if we think about momentum in general, it's a measure that combines both segmental velocities and inertia. So it takes into account both how fast segments are moving and the body's configuration. And in general, if we think about angular momentum, this is going to be related to how much effort is required to arrest a fall. So if I have excessive angular momentum, I'm going to need to generate larger moment about the center of mass to arrest that fall. And in general, it's been observed across several studies that people typically have their whole body angular momentum is relatively small because of how the limbs coordinate with one another. And so recently we've been asking questions about how asymmetry impacts the reactive control of angular momentum. And so for these studies, what we do, again, we still use visual feedback to modify asymmetry, but now instead of using, let's say, an adaptation approach, we're now applying discrete perturbations. So people are walking on the treadmill, and then on steps that they are unable to predict, we accelerate just one of the belts. They lift the foot off the belt, we return the belt to its normal speed. So these are what we call slip-like perturbations. So you can see here, this is an example of the commanded velocity here, where the black trace represents one of our perturbations, where we increase the belt speed by 0.5 meters per second. The second row is just illustrating the ground reaction force. Main point of this is that you can see when we accelerate the belt, you basically see a shorter stance phase, right? So in this case, the normal case, that ground reaction force takes longer to return to zero. And now if we measure angular momentum, so by convention, our right-hand rule, angular momentum is going to be positive if the person is rotating backward and negative if they're rotating forward. So during the acceleration phase, the acceleration phase of the perturbation, you see that the black trace is more negative than the gray, and that's just illustrating that people are falling forward. So one of the things that we wanted to understand when we're thinking about angular momentum is how does the body coordinate the segments throughout the body to regulate whole body angular momentum. And so to illustrate this, let's just take this example where we can take each segment and we can compute the angular momentum of that segment about an axis that goes through the center of mass. So, so we have, many segments. I think this is 3, 6, 12. I think we had a 13 or 14 segment model. And we can take, two take-home points. One, the legs, the lower extremities, have the most dominant contribution to whole body angular momentum. Okay, so the head and trunk aren't making very large contributions, and neither are the arms for this study. We can take all of these signals, pass them through PCA to do dimensionality reduction, and it turns out that with just 2 principal components, we can explain over 95% of the variability in angular momentum. All right, I see there's a question from Reza.
Yes, just a quick clarifying question. Are you calculating these whole body angular momentum about the ground or central to full body center of mass or head?
Yep, great question. So this is about the center of mass. We won't have time here. We have a whole other study that looks at whether the conclusions you make about balance control differ if you use an axis that projects through the center of mass versus basically the foot, right? The point of contact with the ground. I'll talk about that if there's time. Okay. So
that's all in the sagittal plane.
This is all in the sagittal plane from what I'm sharing.
Not the mediolateral, which.
Yes, we've looked at all 3 planes actually. And let me see if there's so at least what I'm presenting here today is focused on the sagittal plane because that's the dominant direction of our perturbation. But there's coupling, definitely. Okay, so one of the major questions we wanted to answer here was, how do people coordinate the limb segments to, I guess, maintain momentum? I'll explain that in a little bit more detail. So we can use PCA to extract what we call intersegmental coordination patterns, where 2 of these patterns are sufficient to explain most of our variance. And then the question is, do these intersegmental coordination patterns change in response to perturbations. Okay, so this is what we're showing here. So to answer that question, we can take our coordination pattern, let's call it our first principal component, from perturbed walking, and we can compute the angle of that vector relative to the first principal component from unperturbed walking, so just normal walking. If the perturbation is leading to a change in intersegmental coordination, then we would expect that angle to, be larger than the noise that we have in our baseline. And so what we can see here is if we just look, this is now symmetric walking, no split belt, we just apply perturbations. That when the perturbation is applied, we have the largest change in or difference in our coordination patterns. And then this is reduced as people recover, and by the third recovery step, they've reestablished their baseline coordination. And so again, I'm talking about segmental coordination and not muscle for those of you who are interested. And we see the same pattern in general with our second principal component. So this is just a response to perturbation. Now we're also interested in what about asymmetry, right? How does asymmetry affect these coordination patterns? So as you might expect, so now we're giving people visual feedback, and sorry, the x-axis here is our measure of asymmetry. And we're comparing our coordination patterns to those from a symmetric walking condition. So as you might suspect, as people become more asymmetric, we can capture that by looking at these intersegmental coordination patterns. So just to make that really clear, if we go to the right here, this is our increasing asymmetry. Okay. So that's not all that surprising. Now the question is, what happens when we look at whole body angular momentum? Right? So whole body angular momentum is now the result of all of these intersegmental coordination patterns. And what I think is really surprising is that even though we have changes in these intersegmental coordination patterns, if we just look at whole body angular momentum, there's no effect of asymmetry. So the different colors here are different levels of step length asymmetry when we're giving people visual feedback. This is a normalized or this is a unitless measure of angular momentum. And we're looking at what happens during baseline walking before our perturbations. PTB is the step where we accelerate the treadmill, and then we look at the next two recovery steps. So, it's pretty easy to see here, but asymmetry, when people are walking with an asymmetric gait, it had no effect on what we might call the proactive control, right, during baseline, or the reactive control during our perturbation and recovery. Taken together, this implies to us that the nervous system seems to, at least in this case, allow for some variable segmental, let me say that again, for nervous system allows for variance in segmental level coordination patterns while maintaining invariant control of whole body angular momentum. So we think this is a really interesting way to understand, sort of coordination and how that might affect some sort of higher level control variables. And so
I have a similar question as Reza, but I'm just wondering whether, because of the time, whether you can conclude that section, and then who wants to continue, like sometimes or frequently there's a hardcore that can still take more, then we'll do just a little intersection and then allow for going further.
Great. I have only one more data slide. So we're almost done, but are there any questions to this point? And I'll stop sharing.
So maybe just cognizant of the time, I would say let's give us all the opportunity to thank you and applause, and then we'll open up for more.
Thank you. Thank you all for your attention. A Zoom seminar.
Oh, there's a bunch of hands. I don't know who came first, but there's James, Tracy, and let's see.
You want to let him finish his last data slide before you open up for questions?
Do you want to show the last data slide, James?
Yeah,
sure.
Those were clapping hands.
Oh.
All right. So this is all of this work that I just showed you about control of momentum was in young, unimpaired individuals. And we've also been, I don't have a lot of data here, but of course we asked similar questions in people post-stroke. And so now if we look at how momentum changes throughout the gait cycle, so this is Sung's work, who's here. We see this, what we call M-shaped profile of momentum. So this captures the, sort of falling forward and rotating backward that occurs throughout the gait cycle. And in people post-stroke, we see that so the negative, remember, negative is forward falling for us. In this transition from the paretic side to the non-paretic, so this is where they are in single limb stance with the paretic, we see that right at that transition point is where they have the most negative momentum. In other words, they're falling forward the fastest. It's not very surprising because they have the least amount of control on their paretic side. And so in this study, we asked what happens if you now, again, ask them to walk more symmetrically? Does this have an effect on their whole body dynamics, specifically angular momentum? And so what we measured here was this peak forward momentum as a function of the change in asymmetry. On the x-axis here is our change in asymmetry, where positive values will be people who actually became more asymmetric. Negative values would be people who became less asymmetric. And then the y-axis is the change in that minimum momentum. So positive values on the y-axis actually mean that they're falling forward even faster. So what we found here was that as people reduce asymmetry, they actually fall forward even faster than they would at baseline. And so we think this is important because this may provide an indication of why, even though some of these individuals can walk more symmetrically, they don't. Because walking more symmetrically may actually increase their instability. Okay? We have other perturbation-related studies that follow on to this, but I won't present that today. So that was the last slide. I won't summarize, but I want to give a moment to thank my collaborators, current, former students, postdocs, collaborators, and funding. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, James. So let's open for more questions if people like.
I have a quick question. James, so one of the things that you mentioned earlier on was part of your work is one of the outputs of your work is informing clinical practice. And I'm wondering what this body of research that you're showing right now, where are you in that? Like, are you at the stage where you can recommend certain clinical paradigms, or are you moving in that direction right now?
Yeah. Yeah, great question, Lou. So one of the big things that we are doing in our work is thinking about, it's maybe an overused term, but really personalization. So one, we think if we're talking about, say, about asymmetry, we saw that for some people, it seemed to be that reducing their asymmetry could actually contribute to a reduction in metabolic cost. So what we really would like to do is to say, well, who are those people? And maybe it makes sense to target asymmetry for that population. Whereas other people, if we try to reduce their asymmetry, at least in the methods we've used, that might be problematic because they have to use energetically inefficient strategies, hip hiking and lots of circumduction, et cetera. So maybe those individuals need a different type of training. Now, in terms of where we are, we have other work that I didn't present here that is really trying to understand the cost and benefits of changes at the individual level for eventual, maybe more sort of prescriptive purposes. TBD in terms of the actual application of that principle, but we're working on it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think John.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the Thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you could tie this back into some of the ways that you started out the talk, when sort of you started showing the spine and saying, you're not so you used to be super into the spine and now you're not so much. And could you tie what you've been talking about to the kind of physiology there, or was that more just a statement about that, like against the idea that pure rhythmic symmetry is a goal of walking? Because it seems like even with an asymmetric gait, there is a rhythm. It's just sort of a complex rhythm.
Yeah. So I'll speak to two elements of that. One is this idea, I'll call it energy optimization. Frankly, energy is what we measure. What the nervous system cares about, in my opinion, is effort, which is what I might say is a much more vague idea, right? We don't really know. There's many aspects to effort. So I do think that requires supraspinal structures to make predictions or at least learn mappings between behavior and effort, and then making decisions about which behaviors to choose. So I think there's a supraspinal component there that's really important. The other component has to do with balance control, with that being also largely supraspinal. And so I think that when we think about the what I've referred to as like the quality or functional measures of gait, energetics and stability, to me, those are inevitably supraspinal circuits that affect those behaviors. So rhythmicity is still really important, but I don't think it's sufficient to get us to these really adaptable, stable locomotor behaviors.
Cool, thank you.
Muddy?
My question is with regards to just this whole site to begin with. So if I remember correctly from Sherrington and Brown, in their studies, they showed that the decerebrated cat, like if you increase the speed of one treadmill, they started double stepping. So when you started a presentation, I was expecting somewhere for double stepping to happen. So I'm just curious why people didn't double step.
Stability. So yeah, I think one of the things that those of us who study locomotion unfortunately have to do is we have to appreciate everything that has been done in terms of the understanding of sort of spinal circuitry and the control of locomotion from lower or quadrupedal vertebrates. However, bipedal gait is not the same as hind limb locomotion. I think that it's a fallacy that I believe for a long time, frankly. So this idea of a double step is something you can do when the rest of your body is supported. So if those in the hind limb stepping experiments, they actually have a harness for the cat. So you can do interesting things when you don't have to worry about, or when there's additional body weight support. Humans, they don't do that. I don't think I have ever, I know that I've never observed a double step.
James.
Was that?
Sorry to interrupt, James. But what about kids? Kids skip frequently. So that's a double step on one side and then a single step on the other. I admit it's an unusual behavior, but
okay. So Yeah, I can speak. I'm speaking specifically in terms of what people do in response to the stimulus that we provide. They don't. So it's not impossible, but they don't choose to do it. And maybe even a more technical note is that so they there's no aerial phase. So skipping would be is a different gait, given that there's an aerial phase. So then they don't change to another qualitatively different gait either. That's not to say that, maybe there could be a skipping solution that's actually maybe better, right, in certain conditions.
So I guess my next question as well is because I'm just not too familiar with this, but the experimental protocol, do you tell the subjects that you're like aiming for lower metabolic cost, or they just do this? Okay.
No, there's no, so the instruction is only to, keep walking. We've not, I think there are really interesting questions that you can ask along those lines, but we haven't. So there's no priming from us as to what the solution should be.
I have I have an idea that might test or support your metabolic criterion. So we are all walking around with masks these days, right? And so walking and running with masks is difficult because, well, you don't get air. So could you have your subjects wear masks where you gently restrict their oxygen uptake and thereby accelerate whatever they need to do to lower their metabolic cost?
All right, so we've had similar questions about how can we disrupt this process? How can we change what we really would like to do is change the mapping between some feature of their gait and the energetic cost of that feature. It's really hard to do because there are like downstream effects. So Max Donelon has actually done what I think is one of the most interesting studies in this domain, where they actually had people breathing air, where they controlled the CO2 concentration.
Right.
And so they can, in a closed loop, modify the amount of oxygen you receive based on what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
The most striking thing is that it didn't matter. So people would persist
Mm-hmm.
in these, more effortful I'm trying to think what's the correct term. Well, they would persist in walking in these hypoxic conditions when by changing something about their gait, they could receive more oxygen. In other words, there's something that is perhaps easier,
Mm-hmm.
but they chose to do this other thing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's and if Jerry Lober here, we would talk a little bit about, habitual control, which is, this tendency to do what it is we have sort of a history of doing. And so, we're still really interested in trying to disambiguate these things. When does habit override something that may be more, let's call it optimal, because that has a broad implications for rehabilitation.
I had a question. So is this minimization of the metabolic cost anyway dependent upon the velocity ratio of the two thing? Like is 3 somehow, like what if I reduce it just to like twice or even less? Will people still do the same thing? And the second part is, after people have done this adaptation, when the experiment is done, have you asked them like if they figure out what they have optimized, like do they figure that out at all? Like yeah, I made it less my breathing steady or something like that. Do they report anything like that?
So for the first question,
so like is it
at the limit? Right. So
Yeah,
at the limit, right, if the belt speeds are difference is 0, then we already know that people tend to adopt, you know, step length and step times that are pretty close to what's energetically optimal. Right? So that's sort of more or less fundamental observation of locomotor control. Now, how that changes with asymmetry, I cited this Steenham and Choi paper. They've looked at a range of asymmetries, and we have some simulation work now that is doing the same thing. My gut says that the objective is not all that dependent on the belt speed ratio. Maybe at the extreme, if you have a 4-to-1, now you know, trying to maintain balance is going to be far more challenging. But I think the objective would remain the same. What was the second part of your question?
And then do people realize what did they learn? Like, do they figure that out?
People say that eventually it was easier, right? It's very hard at the beginning. Eventually it feels easier. But in terms of what they did, no one has ever like explicitly described, you know, I tried to step further forward on the fast belt. You don't know, frankly.
I see. Thank you.
I just maybe want to return to your angular momentum calculations as you calculated it around the center of mass, and you said you have started to look at it around the base of support. And I'm sort of sensitive to that because we did that and compared the two measures when balancing on a beam. And ultimately, we found that the angular momentum around the base of support gave us the more, call it, informative results.
Yeah, so what we found is that, so when you measure angular momentum about the base of support, so you know, let's call it the point of rotation on the ground, or the axis of rotation relative to the ground, the dominant contribution, so if we do this PCA, what you find is that the first component is actually just the center of mass relative to the base of support. So that's the first thing you're measuring, is the sort of the inverted pendulum dynamics. And then the second and third components look like what I showed you earlier. So they are capturing some of this relative motion about the center of mass that, you know, you can project to the to an axis on the ground. So yeah, this.
We kind of subtracted out the trunk contribution.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we haven't done that, but it would be, I mean, so we're writing this paper now, so maybe we will, but I'm wondering if that would give us what, you know, if then once we remove the, let's say, trunk or that center of mass relative to the base, if that would still give us these two components that we have captured here. I'm not sure, but I think it's something we're still trying to wrap our head around what's best.
Yeah.
I think someone, is it Elliot had a question? Was that?
Elliot, you're muted.
Just wondering about other ratios. I mean, other than 2-to-1, 3-to-1, what about 2-to-3? What happens with stuff like that?
For the belt speeds?
Yeah.
So I think you end up doing, the way that I think about this is that you can sort of, you can change belt speed ratio, of course, in different ways. I could change both belt speeds relative to some baseline. I could keep one belt the same and just increase the other. And if I do that, then you can imagine getting, if I do that continuously, you would get all possible ratios. I don't think that the behavior changes qualitatively whether or not you have, you know, integer ratios or not. Yeah, my gut says that it wouldn't matter, but that could be wrong.
I mean, that would get into some of the natural constraints of rhythms, right? The 3-to-1, 2-to-1, those are pretty easy to maintain, whereas 2-to-3 starts to get trickier.
I think temporally that if we were thinking about step times, I think about tapping when you talk about 3 and 2 and 2, right? We know that and I'm sure Dagmar can elaborate on this, right? We know that the ratio, if I do 3 to 2, that's going to be much harder than 4 to 1 and 4 to 2. But with walking, you're still just doing 1 to 1 in terms of the temporal pattern.
Yeah. I was just curious.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. So there's still some really interesting temporal questions that we haven't really explored.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, are we all happy? Yes. Yes, good, good. So I think that was very interesting. Thank you, James.
Thank you.
And I think we got a lot of questions and thoughts from that. So thank you very much. And I guess we'll just do.
Thank you. Yeah, always happy to have other deeper conversations. That's what we do, right?
Yes. Yeah, no lab visits this time.
One last thing, bipedal gait, those octopus studies where they did bipedal gait in those weird circumstances.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that work.
Oh my God, I don't have the paper with me, but there's videos of octopi put the 6 legs up on top of the head for camouflage, or wrap it around their body for camouflage, and then they bipedally gait with the same duty cycle as standard bipedal gait.
Yeah, I'll have to find
can
that.
give you the reference if you can't. I have it.
Yeah, they also do it while like holding shells for protection and stuff like that.
Yeah. For camouflage, to fool predators, basically.
So all I'm taking from this is that we need to attach more appendages to our participants and look at,
I think that'll
octopedal control.
That'll make another good bipedal animal for your initial slides.
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good example. It's nice videos as well. But yeah, take a look at the pangolin if you get a chance. It's a wonderful gait.
Wow.
Okay, so a final thank you, and well, that's it.
All right.
Good night.
Good to see everyone. Bye, Song.